What you're seeing is one of Canada's most famous landmarks, the 401. Often hailed as one of the busiest and widest highways in the world, if not the busiest. The 401 connects Toronto to just about everywhere else. It's the artery that makes Ontario function. Originally built in pieces in the early 20th century to alleviate congestion on lakeshore and other roads, the 401 itself became the source of congestion, even as it got bigger and bigger and bigger. To try and fix the problem, government after government has thrown money at adding new lanes and highways, in the hopes that bigger roads will mean more room for cars. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has offered the latest solution, a 55-kilometer, $60 billion megatunnel built under the 401. An idea that seems completely preposterous until you consider the obsession of Toronto and just about every major city in North America with cars. That obsession is a self-fulfilling prophecy that causes the province to endlessly build new roads in pursuit of a goal that cannot be achieved with roads: less traffic. But in the case of Ontario and Doug Ford, the reasons for sprawling new highways go far beyond a misplaced hope that more lanes will mean less traffic. Instead, to find the true motivation for building these highways means following the money. Before we get into Ontario specifically and all of the new proposed highways, I want to take a look at traffic as a concept. When you think of traffic, there seems to be an obvious solution. If you're stuck in a 4-lane traffic jam, well, just add a 5th lane. It would spread out the cars, give more space, and speed everything up. Roads follow a principle called induced demand. Induced demand means that an increase in supply results in lower cost, and so an increase in consumption. The way this works with highways is that if there are more lanes or roads, driving becomes more appealing, and more people will choose to drive, thus filling the once empty space provided by new roadways. This is why building new roads does not solve traffic problems. Sooner or later, no matter how many roads you build, eventually enough people will choose to drive when they would have otherwise taken other means that those roads become full. Most huge new highway projects help briefly, but within a year or two, traffic is almost always the same or worse than it was before the new highway was built. This phenomenon has been shown in cities around the world time and time again. So why do we keep building them? Well, the answer is much more complicated. One of the simplest answers is that voters want them. Suburban voters, especially in the GTA, have a huge impact on elections at all levels. And historically, suburbanites have favored new roads, since they're more likely to drive in general. If suburbanites are in favor of a new highway, making that an election promise goes a long way. Another reason is that viable solutions to highways in Ontario have historically been neglected by provincial governments. Critics of highways often point to transit as the obvious solution. If transit is faster, cheaper, and more reliable, people will choose to take transit over driving. In the early days of the province, rail lines were built to accommodate new communities and shipping needs. While many rail lines in the province are still heavily used for freight, keeping thousands of trucks off the road each year, passenger rail has declined. Many municipalities have elected to rip up rails in favor of roads or other urban development. And while existing rail lines can be upgraded or repurposed, once a line is removed, it's very difficult to go back. In Toronto, the TTC, which was once one of the better transit systems in North America, has been steadily losing funding since the 1990s. In 1995, Mike Harris's government cut funding to TTC projects and removed the provincial government's subsidy, which was 16% of the TTC's budget at the time. Without that subsidy, the TTC became victim to a cycle of decline. When fares didn't meet expectations, the TTC had no choice but to cut services. Cutting services meant the experience of riding the TTC was worse, so less people did it, meaning less fares and more service cuts. The TTC continues to receive some of the lowest government subsidies of any major transit system in North America, leading to high fare prices and an over-reliance on consistent ridership in order to keep the system running. Since transit isn't working, more people turn to cars, which leads to a perception that more highways are the real solution. And while investments in transit are important, there are a number of investments into roads that may be just as crucial to keeping a city or province moving. And spoilers, they aren't new highways. A traffic study in the northeastern United States found that roundabouts had reduced traffic delays by a minimum of 83% and congestion by at least 58%. Traffic tolls during peak periods are a well-established way to decrease the number of cars on the road and increase public transit use. Although unpopular, tolls are one of the only ways to combat induced demand, because they literally increase the cost of driving in a way that gets people off the roads. Doug Ford recently removed tolls on the Don Valley Parkway. Bike lanes are an extremely low-cost way to incentivize people not to drive, not to mention adding health benefits. Bike lanes reduce bike accidents by 14 to 31%. Doug Ford is also planning to rip out bike lanes in Toronto and pass a bill requiring municipalities to get provincial approval to put in new bike lanes. The point is, whether it be large investments like public transit or smaller investments like bike lanes, toll roads, or roundabouts, there are a variety of different ways to improve traffic congestion. And to some extent, Doug Ford's government seems to realize this. The provincial Conservatives have set aside $70 billion over 10 years for public transit improvements. This investment in public transit also sits in comparison to his proposed investments in Highway 413, the Bradford Bypass, and the potential 401 megatunnel. So why are these such huge priorities? Well, in the case of Doug Ford, it's an old familiar song, Friends in High Places. Highway 413 was originally proposed by a previous Liberal government, but the project was killed in 2018 over environmental and community concerns. Doug Ford's PCs revived it, a highway that is set to stretch across thousands of kilometers of farmland and hundreds of kilometers of previously protected greenbelt space. Huge portions of that land are owned by some of Ontario's biggest and most wealthy developers with intimate connections to Doug Ford's government. Tony Mila, the head of the Ontario PC's fundraising arm, has worked as a consultant for John DePoche, a prominent developer, before and during his time working with the government. DePoche has dealings with Mila all the way back to 1997, when Mila was a manager at the Canada Lands Company, a real estate company that managed federally owned land. At that time, Mila sold 30 acres of federally owned land to DePoche for $58,000 an acre. A month later, DePoche sold that land for $165,000 an acre. Three more developers, the De Gasperis, Argo Development, and Fieldgate, all employ Peter Van Loan as a lobbyist. Van Loan was the government House leader under Stephen Harper and also the chair of Caroline Mulrooney's 2018 PC leadership campaign. Mulrooney was the Minister of Transportation from 2019 until 2023. Van Loan's stated area of influence for his lobbying is impact of proposed highway on clients' land. Another developer invited Doug Ford and PC MPP Stephen Lecce to a private box at a Florida Panthers game in 2018, although the government said both Ford and Lecce paid for their own tickets and no business was discussed. Collectively, the developers along the route of Highway 413 own 3,300 acres of land that were valued at around $500 million at the time of acquisition, although much of that land has been held for over a decade, meaning the value is likely much more. And the land value would rise dramatically if the highway is built and the land is able to be developed. Many of those developers are prolific PC donors, having contributed at least $800,000 to the party since 2014. And while Doug Ford has been fighting for the 413 since 2018, it's been slow going. There has been substantial pushback from the public and opposition parties, and the federal government had paused the project for some time in order to do a proper environmental assessment, something the feds decided to abandon in 2024. Despite that, the Ford government has utilized a previously rarely used tool to develop lands near the proposed 413 without public support or environmental assessments, allowing developers to skip the waiting process and develop on what were once protected lands. Something called a Minister's Zoning Order, or MZO. In April 2020, they used an MZO to approve developers' plans to destroy 3 protected wetlands in Vaughan in order to build a Walmart distribution center. These wetlands were previously deemed provincially significant, meaning they were some of the most important environments in the province. So the developers agreed to build new wetlands nearby as a replacement. So why not simply build the distribution center somewhere else? There could be a number of reasons, but the developed land is near where the 413 would join Highway 400. In July 2020, they used an MZO to approve a housing development in Caledon near a proposed 413 interchange that had been in the works for nearly 10 years, but had been postponed due to the Liberals' decision to shelve Highway 413. In November 2020, an MZO rezoned farmlands next to the Greenbelt for 5 new neighborhoods, less than 2 kilometers away from a proposed interchange with Highway 413. The Ford government has used nearly 10 times more MZOs since 2018 than all other governments combined over the last 15 years. To date, they've used over 100. Previous governments used 18 in 15 years. Proponents of this heavy-handed approach have said that it's all in the name of economic recovery. The vast majority of the government's MZOs happened during the height of the pandemic, in an attempt to create jobs and boost the economy faster. And there certainly is some merit to that argument. However, the government's repeated use of MZOs to bypass environmental protections and develop over-endangered habitats and important environmental areas is troubling, and the frequency with which those MZOs directly benefit those who are connected to the Conservative Party is concerning. 9 MZOs, the most given to any single company, went to a close friend of Doug Ford, Shakir Rahmatullah, who was also behind several bids to get the Ontario PCs to open up part of the Greenbelt for development. Companies owned by Mario Cortellucci, one of the people who own significant land along the path of Highway 413, has received 6 MZOs. Doug Ford's ex-executive assistant received 2 MZOs, and the Ford-appointed chairman of Ontario Place and vice president of the PC's fundraising arm got 1. If you look at the proposed Bradford Bypass, the pattern continues. In 2021, the Ministry of Transportation slightly altered the path of the proposed highway. The new path, they said, would lessen the impact on the Holland River and avoid an archaeological site. It also avoided a golf course and instead cut through a number of homes. The golf course, it turns out, is owned by the father of Conservative MP Stan Cho, who happens to be the Associate Minister of Transportation. In the interest of full disclosure, the decision to avoid the golf course came shortly before Cho was appointed Associate Minister of Transportation, and Cho did declare a conflict of interest when he took on the role. As with Highway 413, thousands of acres of land along the proposed Bradford Bypass are owned by those same developers, with connections to Doug Ford and the Conservatives. So, where does this all leave us? Despite mountains of evidence from a wide variety of agencies that have come to the same conclusion about what does work in regards to reducing traffic congestion, and years of evidence establishing that building new highways does not, in any meaningful way, reduce gridlock, the Ontario government has chosen to pour billions of dollars into 2 highways that will destroy hundreds of kilometers of protected green space, displace people from their homes, and likely will be clogged within a year or 2. Considering that both these highways were once proposed by Liberal governments long before Ford took office, I would be tempted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Even if the evidence says highways don't work, that's just what we do in Ontario. But this is not Doug Ford's first strike, not when it comes to giving backroom deals to developer friends, and not when it comes to developing protected lands to the benefit of himself and his rich associates. This is a pattern. And while even in the face of this, Doug Ford's substantial investment into transit is encouraging, it doesn't erase the cloud of corruption that has covered this government for years, leaving Ontarians to wonder which decisions are being made for their benefit, and which ones are to line the pockets of Doug Ford's friends.